Hi guys, it's Unders, and today we are going to have a look at the differences between multiband compressors and dynamic EQs. Some strange mystery kind of thing going on, and some questions been thrown about, and some crazy ideas that things are wildly different. And we're just going to basically have a look at why the lines are so blurred, and that effectively they're not massively different tools, but they've come from different places. So these kinds of videos are helpful for you guys. Pop a subscribe on the channel, pop a like on the video. It does help me massively in creating more content for you guys. So as you can see up on the screen, I have got Wave's wonderful C4. It is a multi-band compressor that's been around for probably 10 years, maybe more. I remember it from about 2008, which I think is when I bought this. That makes me feel really, really old. Okay, so the key thing about a multi-band compressor is essentially they are modeled on hardware that existed. And the idea being they are a series of compressors that break the frequency spectrum up into a number of bands. C4 breaks it up into 4 bands. Now the key thing to note about this, when we look at the C4, you've got these arcs here if you follow the mouse around. So we've got this little green dot here, we follow this arc round. That is the full frequency area it actually affects, and you get these crossover points here. So this fades off what I think is a 12 decibel per octave drop off. This then fades off at a 12 decibel drop off. When they cross over, they then cross over perfectly, bringing the balance back to what would be a flat spectrum across here, because they're crossing over with the same amount of decay at the same points, so then they equal perfect volume. That's how crossover works. Now the thing with a multi-band compressor, your spectrum is always split into these crossovers in these areas. Thus it's always split into 4 or more compressors, however you want to look at it. For example, you've got the C6, which goes into more than that. I think like Maximus from Image Line is split into 3. Various different things like that. So what you've essentially got is 4 compressors working, which work in exactly the same way as a regular compressor, except only over the bands that you've got chosen here. So we play this little snippet of the track here, and we can see what's going on, and we can grab a band and dip bits of it out. Lovely, and we can see how it affects the audio in different frequency areas. Key thing to note, you've generally got 2 what would be described as bells in the middle, because they're sort of the bell EQ curve, and then you tend to have a high shelf and low shelf at the end, and that is the same across the hardware multibands you get. So if you ever go to, say, a mastering studio where they are using the Tube Tech, that's a really popular like mastering multiband compressor, works in exactly the same way. It's got a high shelf, low shelf, mid band, exactly the same as like an EQ, but it's working as a compressor as well. Now something we would have seen more recently on the channel is Neutron. It's been up and around loads. Now this is a dynamic EQ, and the differences are sort of paramount in the fact that you don't have the same ways to attenuate that you do with a compressor. So we've got compress and expand. Expanding is something else that multiband compressors can do when you tell it to push up rather than push down. But you don't have attack ratios and things like that, and then you can also adjust the Q, and you don't suffer from crossovers. This is very similar to if you had a hardware EQ and every time something hit in, you turned down that EQ band, you turn the gain down yourself, because it's not split into a set of crossovers. At least in the digital realm, it's not split into a load of different crossovers. It's all one band in how it's affected. Now, an Analogue EQ is set up in series. They're not crossovers, but they're a series. So the first part of the EQ affects this particular band, and then that then transfers into the next one, the next one, and the next one, rather than you have the band set and then it's crossed over, so each band only gets a certain bit of the spectrum. So an Analogue EQ gets the full spectrum across each of its bands set up in series. A similar thing works here, but it's slightly different in the digital world. And that is essentially it. So we can get a similar sort of thing happening with it, but we can also have areas not unaffected, or we can have some areas expand, and we don't have to worry about the crossover frequencies. So with things like the low end, it's just affecting that particular area. Now, the reason I grabbed Neutron for this is if we hold Alt, we can actually see the whole area that's being affected, but because of the way the Q works and things like that, it doesn't work as a crossover. Let's just have a look at how it responds. We'll have to set it up. Fab, so I've grabbed that 3 band there. You see that I've pulled it right the way down and it's in compression, but it's not actually affecting whatsoever. It's not being pulled down. Now, if that was a dynamic EQ, it's crossing that threshold. Dynamic EQ would look at the ratio and go, right, I need to pull this down by whatever volume of dB. Doesn't happen with a dynamic EQ. It's going to be dependent on this gain. So like I said, it'd be like you pushing the gain down each time manually. So if we now bring this down by, well, let's do a ridiculous amount, nearly 7 dB, and we'll be able to really see that affecting. If we take the threshold off here, we can see it stops affecting. So instead of a ratio, it's dependent on the gain level that you've pulled down against the threshold, and that's where the calculation's made into how much dips down. Now in Neutron, you don't get any kind of attack and release, and that would be that's a commonplace with how these work. We're going to move on to another one in a second that does allow for that, and this is where we start to get sort of real hybrids going on. Now, if you were to look at a dynamic EQ in the hardware world, there are very, very few options. The only one that I can find that is still being made is by Behringer, and internally it's actually a digital dynamic EQ. Thus, it's no different to having software apart from you're plugging into the thing. So let's have a look at, again, another one by Izotope. This is the one that comes with Ozone. I don't know if it only comes with the advanced version, but either way, it's available here. Now, the key thing here, we can again change the Q bands, we can change the type of peaks as well as the high and low shelf, but this guy does allow for inverse modes and some other things, as well as attack and release. So this is responding a lot more like a compressor, but still note there's not a ratio. It's dependent on how you gain control it. You can make it respond a lot slower, but it's still dependent on that threshold and gain, and that's a key difference here. It's not working like a compressor in the terms of having a ratio against the amount of volume that goes past that ratio for attenuation. The attenuation is always controlled by you. So now if we move on to the final example I've got, this is the absolute hybrid that blurs the lines completely and probably the reason for a load of confusion. Is Fabfilter Pro Multiband. Now essentially this starts with nothing, and you can add channels in as and where you like. You can change the response of it, you can change the attack and release times. At the heart of it, it's a multiband compressor, but it also allows you to work as if it's an EQ, and it is the absolute hybrid between the two. So these bands are now working completely separately. They've got a crossover, but we can do this and get it so they're away from each other and not crossing over at all if we really want. So it's working more like a dynamic EQ in that respect. And if we bring them closer together, and now we've got a crossover point here, it's working more like a multiband compressor. If we bring them right close together, it actually joins them and is working exactly like a multiband compressor and has the same controls for it. So it's very unusual in that respect. Why can't we unzip you two? There we are. So it allows for compression, expansion. effectively EQ curving as well, because we can change these slope points into how they respond, so it works more like EQ. However, it is a multi-band compressor because you are choosing a threshold, a ratio, and it's attenuating the level based on that ratio crossover. You do not choose the attenuation and then choose a threshold to attenuate to. That is the key difference between a multi-band compressor and a dynamic EQ. Effectively, look at the controls. So if you're setting a threshold, you're setting a ratio, you're using a multi-band compressor. If you are bringing a level down like an EQ and then setting a threshold for where that level is going to pull down to, without any ratio, just purely based on what you've pulled down, that's a dynamic EQ. So Neutron, really traditional, how we would expect to see dynamic EQ. C4, exactly what we'd expect to see with a multi-band compressor. Fabfilter Pro MB, somewhere in between the two, but is a multi-band compressor, as named because of the compressor standard that we're using. Key thing, that ratio, that is where the real defining thing comes in. Both can be used for similar applications. You can get similar results. They're great for using DSs, pulling out harsh frequencies, adding bits of expansion. I've done things in the past where I can pull down the fundamental of something else and then boost up the top end all in that one plugin and just have it respond dynamically. That's great. I can work with the dynamic EQ and the multi-band compressor. And you know what? If you guys want, we'll look at doing things like that in future videos. Just pop a like on this one for me and let me know that's what you want to see, and we will do it. Thank you very much for your time, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Catch you next time.